Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I was in a new town, traveling for work, and desperately needed a haircut. I had been putting it off for weeks, and the upcoming conference wasn't going to wait for my messy appearance. A quick search on my phone led me to a small barbershop tucked between a hardware store and a bakery. It wasn't flashy, just a simple red and white striped pole and a faded sign that read Jimmy's Cuts. The moment I walked in, I felt off. The shop was dimly lit, and the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, like pennies. A lone barber, a wiry man in his 60s with neatly combed gray hair, stood behind the chair, wiping it down. He looked up and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Walk in," he asked. I hesitated but nodded. There were no other customers, and I figured it would be quick. He motioned for me to sit, and I climbed into the chair, the cracked vinyl creaking beneath me. As he draped the cape over me, he locked the door. I tried to tell myself it was for safety, maybe they'd had theft issues, but my stomach tightened. He moved behind me, picking up a pair of scissors, and began snipping at my hair with precision. His movements were almost too smooth, like he'd done this 1,000 times but was just going through the motions. "New in town?" he asked. "Just visiting," I replied, keeping my tone light. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. The mirrors in front of me were old and cloudy, distorting our reflections just enough to be unsettling. Halfway through the cut, there was a faint noise. It sounded like a muffled thud coming from somewhere below us. I stiffened, and the barber paused, scissors hovering near my ear. "Rats in the basement," he said, his voice casual. "Old building." I tried to laugh it off, but the noise came again. This time, it was louder, followed by what sounded like a soft, desperate cry. My heart started racing. "Do you need to check that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His hand gripped my shoulder, firm and cold. "No need," he said, his tone low. "Almost done." I wanted to bolt, but with the cape on and his scissors so close to my head, I felt trapped. The cries grew louder, more distinct now, human, pleading. I must have looked panicked because he suddenly smiled, wide and unsettling. "Don't worry, some noises you learn to live with." I don't know how I didn't jump out of that chair right then. I sat frozen as he finished the cut, meticulously brushing off stray hairs and patting my shoulder like we were old friends. He removed the cape, and I all but threw cash at him before rushing to the door. He unlocked it slowly, as if savoring my discomfort, and I bolted out into the sunlight. I didn't look back, but as I hurried down the street, I thought I saw movement in the shop's basement window, just a shadow, fleeting but unmistakable. Later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I searched for Jimmy's Cuts online, hoping to find reviews or something to explain the eerie encounter. What I found made my blood run cold. News articles about the disappearance of several people in the area over the past decade. One mentioned that some of the victims were last seen near the same block as the barber shop. I reported what I experienced to the local police, but nothing ever came of it. A few months later, I checked again, and the barber shop was gone, replaced by a new cafe, no trace of Jimmy's Cuts ever existing. For months after that, I couldn't shake the memories of Jimmy's Cuts. Every time I replayed that day in my mind, I felt like I had barely escaped something horrible. The way the barber smiled, the noises from the basement, and his chilling words all played on a loop in my head. But I tried to move on. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be with lingering paranoia. I kept an eye on local news in the town, half hoping to see some breakthrough, some confirmation of my gut feeling. Nothing ever came up. Then, a year later, I was traveling again for work. Different town, different state. I was walking back to my hotel after dinner when something caught my eye. Across the street was a small barbershop. It wasn't Jimmy's Cuts, but the pole outside and the faded lettering on the window gave me a flash of deja vu. I stopped, staring at it, my heart racing for no reason I could explain. That's when I noticed the barber inside. He was sweeping the floor, his back to the window. His gray hair was combed neatly, and even from across the street, I recognized his wiry frame. It couldn't be him. I stood there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just someone who looked like him. But then he turned around, and our eyes met. The barber stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. His lips curled into a smile, and I felt like my stomach dropped to my feet. I hurried back to my hotel, locking the door behind me. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with questions. Had he followed me? Was it a coincidence? Or was I imagining things? The next morning, I went back to the spot, determined to prove to myself that it wasn't him. But when I got there, the shop was gone. The building was there, but it was boarded up, and the for lease sign in the window was covered in dust. It looked like no one one had been inside for months. I felt like I was losing my mind. I even asked a nearby cafe owner if they knew anything about the barber shop. She looked at me, confused, and said there hadn't been a barber there for years. That was the last time I saw him, if it was even him. But to this day, I avoid barber shops whenever I can. I've switched to cutting my own hair. It's not perfect, but it's safe. After that eerie encounter, I made it a point to never talk about it. Whenever friends or family asked about my haircuts, I'd just laugh it off and say I was learning a new skill. Deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just fear, it was survival. For a few years, things were uneventful. I convinced myself that whatever I'd experienced was over. Maybe it had been a strange coincidence, or maybe my imagination had gotten the better of me. But then, 3 months ago, something happened that shattered my sense of safety. It started with a package. One evening, I came home from work to find a small box on my doorstep. It was plain brown, no return address, just my name neatly printed in block letters. My first thought was that it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor's package, but curiosity got the better of me. I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a pair of scissors. Not just any scissors, but the kind barbers use, the ones with the shiny silver blades and the slightly curved handles. They looked old but well maintained, like they'd been used for years. My hand started shaking as I picked them up. Beneath the scissors was a single scrap of paper. Written on it, in the same block letters, was one word, soon. I dropped the scissors like they'd burn me. My mind raced with questions. Who had sent this? How did they know where I lived? My thoughts immediately went back to the barber. But hell, it had been years, and I hadn't seen or heard anything about him since that night. I called the police, but they didn't take it seriously. They told me it was probably a prank or a mix-up and suggested I install a security camera if I was worried. That night, I barely slept, every creak and groan of my apartment making my heart race. The next few weeks were uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I installed cameras around my apartment and even changed my locks, but the paranoia lingered. I checked the footage obsessively, but nothing unusual ever showed up. I started thinking maybe the police were right, maybe it was just a sick joke. Then, one night, I came home late from work. As I unlocked my door, I noticed a faint, metallic smell one I hadn't smelled in years. My stomach turned, and I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. I pushed the door open and immediately saw it. On the floor of my living room, arranged neatly in the center of the rug, was a pile of hair. My hair, the same shade, the same length, it was unmistakable. I hadn't cut my hair in months, and yet here it was, like someone had taken clippings from a fresh haircut. I didn't even bother looking around. I ran out, called the police, and waited in my car until they arrived. They searched the apartment and found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence at all that anyone had been there. They tried to tell me I might have forgotten the hair, maybe I trimmed it myself and left it there. But I knew better. Someone had been in my apartment. That night, I didn't go back. I checked into a hotel and started making plans to move. I couldn't stay there, not when I knew someone could get in so easily. A week later, I moved across the country. I didn't tell anyone except close family where I was going. I wanted to disappear, to start fresh where no one could find me. For a while, it worked. I felt safer, like I'd finally outrun whatever had been haunting me. But last night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft sound outside my apartment door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. I walked to the peephole, heart pounding, and looked through. The hallway was empty, but taped to my door was a single piece of paper. Written on it, in block letters, were 2 words, mice cut. This happened when I was 16, and it still makes my skin crawl. My hometown was small, surrounded by fields and cut in half by a set of train tracks. On one side were the schools and the neighborhoods, on the other, a few businesses and the old factory that had been shut down for decades. To save time walking, most kids used the pedestrian tunnel under the tracks, a graffitied, dimly lit stretch of concrete that always smelled like mildew. It was late fall, and the days were already short. I was coming back from my friend Jenna's house on the business side, heading home after losing track of time. It was just after dusk, the streetlights flickering on as I approached the tunnel. The tunnel felt different that night, quieter, like the world on either side of it had been muted. I told myself I was being silly. I just needed to walk through and get home. The moment I stepped in, I saw it, a single balloon floating in the middle of the tunnel. It was bright orange and tied to a string. It's now wrapped around a rusty bolt sticking out of the concrete wall. I froze for a second. Balloons were unusual. Kids sometimes played pranks, but this one looked off. It was too clean, too new, almost glowing under the flickering light. Shaking off the unease, I kept walking, passing it as far to the side as I could. Halfway through, I heard a sharp snap. My head whipped around, and I saw the balloon string had come loose. The balloon was drifting toward me, slowly, like it had a mind of its own. My first thought was, it's just the wind, except there was no breeze. The air was still, damp, and heavy. I hurried my pace, my shoes slapping against the wet concrete. The balloon picked up speed too, gliding in my direction. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to look back. The balloon was was right behind me now, but that wasn't the worst part. Underneath the tunnel's dim light, I saw the shadow it cast on the wall. It wasn't the shadow of a balloon. The silhouette was tall and human-like, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, arms hanging at odd angles. It flickered as the balloon drifted closer, like it was struggling to fully exist in the space. I broke into a run, the sound of my own breath echoing in my ears. The exit was so close, the streetlights just a few feet away. As I reached the end, I felt something tug at my jacket, just lightly, like a hand brushing against the fabric. I stumbled out into the open air and spun around. The balloon was gone. The tunnel was empty. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. For weeks after, I avoided the tunnel, even if it meant adding 20 minutes to my walk. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Jenna about it. She gave me a strange look and said, "Who didn't hear? A kid got hit by a train there a couple of years ago. People say he was carrying balloons for his sister's birthday when it happened. I haven't been back to that tunnel since. For years, I avoided anything that reminded me of that night. The sound of trains, damp tunnels, even balloons. The experience stayed with me, but I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined the shadow, that my brain had tricked me in the panic of the moment. That all changed last month. I'm 24 now, and my parents still live in the same town. I moved away for college and started a new job, but I came back for a weekend visit. One afternoon, my mom asked me to run an errand to the pharmacy on the business side of town. I almost said no. I didn't want to be anywhere near that tunnel, but it was broad daylight, and I told myself it would be fine. The tunnel was still there, looking just as grimy and foreboding as ever. I hadn't stepped foot inside it since that night, but now, in the sunlight, it seemed harmless. I took a deep breath and walked in. The tunnel was exactly as I remembered. The smell of mildew, the faint graffiti on the walls, and the oppressive silence. Halfway through, I slowed down. I don't know why, but something felt wrong, and then I saw it. An orange balloon. It wasn't in the middle of the tunnel this time. It was tied to the same rusty bolt in the wall, just like before. My stomach dropped. The knot on the string looked identical, and the balloon itself was impossibly pristine. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. Before I could force myself to run, I heard it, the faint hissing sound, like air escaping from a tire. Slowly, the balloon began to deflate, crumpling in on itself. But as it shrank, the shadow returned. It flickered on the wall, clearer this time. It was the same figure as before, tall, misshapen, and impossibly wrong. Its limbs bent and shifted unnaturally, like it was struggling to hold itself together. But this time, the shadow moved toward me without the balloon. I turned and sprinted, nearly tripping over my own feet. The hissing sound grew louder, followed by something else, a voice. Why didn't you help me? It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. I didn't stop running until I was out of the tunnel and across the street. When I finally dared to look back, the tunnel was empty. The balloon was gone. I don't know what it wanted from me. I don't know if it was the spirit of the boy who had died there, or if it was something darker, using his story to lure people in. But I do know this. Whatever it was, it remembered me. I told my parents what happened, and they didn't laugh. My dad, who's always been skeptical of anything supernatural, said, "We'll take the long way from now on. I don't plan to go back to that tunnel, ever." I wish I could say that was the end of it, but things have gotten worse. A few weeks after I saw the shadow again, I started noticing strange things happening in my apartment. At first, it was small stuff, lights flickering, a faint tapping on the windows even though I live on the 3rd floor. I chalked it up to old wiring and overthinking, but then the balloons started showing up. The first one appeared on a random Thursday. I was leaving for work when I found it tied to the railing outside my apartment door. It was orange. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of coincidence. Maybe a kid in the building had left it there, but when I checked with my neighbors, no one knew anything about it. The next one showed up 2 days later, this time inside my apartment. I had just come home from running errands when I saw it floating in the corner of my living room, perfectly still. My heart stopped. I knew I hadn't left it there, and my door had been locked when I got home. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at it, until I finally forced myself to step inside. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and popped the balloon. The sound echoed through the room, unnaturally loud. My ears rang for a moment, and then everything went silent. Not the normal kind of quiet, but the same oppressive silence I felt in the tunnel. I slept with the lights on that night. The final straw came a week later. I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the bathroom, when I heard a faint hiss. My heart sank. I turned around slowly, and there it was, another orange balloon, floating in the hallway behind me. I stared at it, too terrified to move. And then, in the mirror behind me, I saw the shadow. It wasn't just on the wall this time. It was standing directly behind me. Its head was tilted at that same unnatural angle, and its limbs twitched as if it were struggling to stay upright. Its reflection didn't move when I turned around. It just stared at me through the glass, even though there was nothing behind me in the hallway. That was it. I grabbed my phone and left the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door. I spent the night at a friend's place, shaking and barely able to explain what had happened. The next next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was moving out. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my security deposit. I just needed to get out. I stayed with my parents for a while after that, but I still don't feel safe. Even now, I sometimes feel like I'm being watched. Every once in a while, I'll see something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of orange, a flickery shadow. I don't know if it followed me or if it's just my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. I was studying abroad in Europe, living in a small, picturesque town with cobblestone streets and a huge medieval clock tower in the center. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, quiet, serene, and charmingly old-fashioned. I loved it. One evening in late autumn, I had an assignment that required me to sketch architectural details from around the town. I saved the clock tower for last because it was a focal point and, frankly, the most beautiful structure there. I arrived around 8 p.m., just as the sun had set. The streets were mostly empty, but the tower's face was lit up, its hands glowing against the darkening sky. As I was sketching, I noticed something odd. There was a figure standing on the narrow balcony that circled the tower just below the clock face. The tower wasn't open to the public, at least not at that hour. It was one of those places where you had to buy tickets during the day for a guided tour. The figure was motionless, facing outward as if staring down at the square. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell they were tall and wearing something dark, maybe a long coat. I assumed it was a maintenance worker or someone who had access to the tower after hours, so I didn't think much of it. I continued sketching for another 20 minutes, occasionally glancing up. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, still as a statue. I started to feel uneasy. Something about the way they were positioned, the utter lack of movement, gave me chills. Deciding I'd had enough for the night, I packed up my sketchbook and pencils and turned to leave. As I did, I glanced back one last time and froze. The figure was gone. The balcony was empty. I scanned the square, expecting to see someone coming out of the tower's main entrance, but there was no one. The streets were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably close. It was coming from above. I looked up and saw nothing, but the whisper continued, just barely audible. It sounded like my name. I didn't stick around to investigate. I practically sprinted back to my apartment, heart pounding. When I got inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The next day, I asked a local friend about the clock tower. I didn't tell her what I'd seen or heard, just casually mentioned it to see if there was anything unusual about it. Her face went pale. That tower's been sealed off for years, she said. Nobody's allowed up there, not even maintenance workers. They stopped letting people inside after someone fell from the balcony about 10 years ago. It was ruled an accident, but some people say. She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Say what? I pressed. Some people say the clock stopped for 3 days after it happened, and at night, you can still hear them up there. A few months after I left that town, I received an email from my professor asking if I wanted to submit the unfinished sketch for a local exhibition. He thought the incomplete lines added a raw, intriguing element. I politely declined. I didn't want to see that clock tower again, not even on paper. Life moved on, but the memory of that night didn't. For a while, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Stress, fatigue, or even the eerie atmosphere of an old European town could play tricks on anyone's mind, right? That's what I told myself. But then something happened that made me question everything. About a year later, I was back in my home country, working part-time at a local art gallery. One evening, as I was closing up, a man came in just before we locked the doors. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and had an almost unnervingly blank expression. "I heard you studied abroad," he said, his voice low and calm. I nodded, uneasy. "Yes, in Europe. How did you know that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. "I think this belongs to you," he said. My heart sank as I unfolded it. It was my unfinished sketch of the clock tower, the one I had left in my apartment overseas, abandoned and forgotten. Every detail was exactly as I had drawn it, down to the faint pencil marks where I'd erased and redrawn parts of the balcony. But there was something new on the paper, a tiny, dark figure drawn in the exact spot where I had seen the person standing that night. I looked up, but the man was already gone. The gallery door was still locked, and I hadn't heard it open or close. The room was empty, and the only sound was my own breathing. I quit the gallery job shortly after that and moved in with my sister for a while, hoping that being around family would help me shake the unease. I never saw the man again, but every so often, I feel like I'm being watched. When I'm walking alone at night, when I'm sitting at a cafe near a window, sometimes I catch a glimpse of someone in a long, dark coat out of the corner of my eye. I've stopped sketching, and I avoid clock towers altogether. For a long time, I thought I was finally free of it, whatever it was. But the unease never really went away, and strange things kept happening, though infrequently enough that I could dismiss them as coincidence. One winter evening. About 3 years after that encounter at the gallery, I was working late at my new job, doing inventory at a small bookstore. The store had big glass windows that faced the street, and as the snow fell, it blanketed everything in a peaceful, muffled silence. I was the only one there, and the cozy glow of the shop's lights felt safe. Then I saw him standing across the street. Partially obscured by the swirling snow was the man in the dark coat. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at me. My stomach turned to ice. It had been years, and yet I recognized him immediately. It was the same coat, the same height, the same blank, unsettling presence. I turned away, pretending I hadn't seen him, and tried to focus on my work. But when I glanced back a moment later, he was closer. Not across the street anymore, but standing directly outside the window, his face partially hidden in shadow. His breath fogged the glass as he stood there, motionless, watching me. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of it all. How had he moved so quickly, so silently? And more importantly, why was he here? I grabbed my phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. There were no footprints in the snow where he had been standing, which the officer chalked up to the wind covering them up. I wasn't so sure. The officer offered to walk me home, but I declined. I didn't want anyone else getting caught up in whatever this was. Instead, I called a cab and left town for a week, staying with an old friend until I felt brave enough to return. But it didn't stop there. The final straw came just a few months ago. I was staying in a new apartment in a completely different city, trying to rebuild my life yet again. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of fate ticking. At first, I thought it was my wall clock, but when I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from my closet. My heart raced as I crept toward the door, the ticking growing louder with each step. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was deliberate, like someone was clicking their fingernails against wood. With trembling hands, I flung the closet door open, but there was nothing there, just darkness. The sound stopped immediately, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and by morning, I had packed my bags. I'm staying with family again, moving from place to place every few weeks, always looking over my shoulder. I don't know what's happening or why this figure keeps appearing, but I've stopped trying to rationalize it. About 5 years ago, I was hired as a freelance sound technician for a small, regional theater company. The gig seemed straightforward: run the soundboard during rehearsals and performances of a new play. I'd done similar jobs before, but this one came with an unusual perk: free accommodation in an old, historic hotel located near the theater. The hotel was quaint but a little too quiet for my liking. I was the only guest staying on my floor, and it had that musty, antique vibe: faded carpets, dark wood, and creaky doors. The receptionist warned me the elevator was temperamental and advised me to take the stairs if it started acting up. I didn't think much of it. I was there to work, not to relax. The first couple of nights were uneventful. I'd come back from rehearsals, eat something in my room, and crash. On the third night, after a particularly long tech rehearsal, I returned to my room around midnight. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard a faint click from the room next door. It startled me because, as far as I knew, that room was unoccupied. I paused, key halfway in the lock, listening for any follow-up noise, but it was silent. Shrugging it off, I went inside and locked the door behind me. It wasn't until I lay down that I realized something else. I hadn't seen anyone else in the hotel since I checked in. Not another guest, not even a cleaning staff, just the receptionist at the desk during the day. The next day, I asked the receptionist if the room next to mine was booked. She looked puzzled and shook her head. No, that whole side of the floor is vacant. I felt a little foolish, but figured it was the building settling or something equally mundane. I didn't mention it again. That night, I was woken up around 2 a.m. by a loud thud. It sounded like something heavy hitting the wall separating my room from the vacant one next door. I sat up in bed, heart racing, listening intently. There it was again, thud. Then a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the wall. This wasn't my first late night hotel scare, so I convinced myself it was pipes or maybe an animal trapped in the walls. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sounds were deliberate. They had a patter to them. I put on my headphones, blasted some white noise, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to mention it to the receptionist again. She looked a little uneasy this time and said she'd have someone check the room, just in case. That night, I came back from the theater later than usual. Close to 1 a.m. as I climbed the stairs to my floor, I noticed the hallway lights were dimmer than usual. Only every other bulb seemed to be working. When I reached my door, I froze. The door to the room next to mine was wide open. I couldn't see much inside. It was pitch black beyond the doorway. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, every instinct screaming at me to go back downstairs and tell the receptionist, but I didn't. Against my better judgment, judgment, I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I shone the light into the room, and it was empty, not just unoccupied, but stripped bare, no bed, no furniture, no curtains. Just an empty room with peeling wallpaper and an old radiator in the corner. And then I heard it tap, tap, tap right behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. My flashlight beam flickered for a moment, and then the tapping started again, louder this time, echoing down the hall. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside on the street. I didn't care that it was freezing, or that I was wearing pajamas and had left my wallet and keys in the room. I sat on a bench across the street until sunrise, staring up at the window of my room, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. The next morning, I checked out and told the receptionist I wouldn't be staying for the rest of the production. She didn't seem surprised. As I left, she said something that still chills me. "You're not the first guest to complain about that room, but you're the first one who left without finishing your stay." After I left the hotel, I didn't want to think about when it happened. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or a prank by some local kid sneaking into the old building. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with that place. The play wrapped a couple of weeks later, and I moved on to another project in a completely different city. Life went on. I didn't tell anyone about my experience, partly because it felt too bizarre to explain, and partly because I didn't want to seem paranoid. About 6 months later, I received an email from one of the actors in the play. We weren't particularly close, so I was surprised to hear from them. The subject line just read, "The Hotel." Curious and a little uneasy, I opened the email. It was short, only a couple of sentences. "Hey, I remembered you stayed at the during rehearsals. Just thought you should know. One of the new actors stayed there for a few nights and had some weird stuff happen, too. She ended up leaving mid-run and wouldn't say why. Thought you might find it interesting." My stomach dropped. I replied, asking for more details, but they didn't have much else to share, just that the actor had checked out without an explanation, leaving her things behind, and hadn't been in touch with the company since. I wanted to let it go, but curiosity got the better of me. I started searching online for anything about the hotel, reviews, news articles, local history. Most of what I found were generic comments about how charming and historic it was, but one post on a small travel forum caught my attention. It was from someone who had stayed there years earlier. Their story was eerily similar to mine: strange noises, the feeling of being watched, and unexplained tapping from an empty room. But they mentioned one detail I hadn't told anyone. The tapping started slow and quiet, but it always ended with 3 loud knocks, like someone pounding on the wall. I slammed my laptop shut. That was exactly what I'd heard the night I ran out. For weeks, I avoided looking into it any further. I wanted to forget, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Eventually, I caved and reached out to a local historian who specialized in old buildings in the area. I didn't mention my experience, just asked if they knew anything unusual about the hotel. Their response gave me chills. The historian told me the hotel had been built in the early 1900 seconds and had changed hands several times over the decades. During its heyday, it was a popular spot for traveling salesmen and performers, but it had also been the site of several unexplained disappearances. Most were dismissed as guests skipping out on their bills or moving on without notifying anyone, but there was one case in particular that stood out. In the 1930s, a sound technician, like me, had stayed at the hotel while working on a local theater production. He was known to be meticulous and punctual, but one day he simply vanished. His belongings were left neatly packed in his room, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The only clue was a report from another guest who claimed to have heard loud tapping sounds coming from his room the night before he disappeared. The police investigated but found nothing. The case went cold, and the story became a local legend. Over time, it was mostly forgotten, except by those who knew the hotel's history. I haven't been back to that town since. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer, tried to figure out what was really going on. But then I think about that empty room, the open door, the tapping that seemed to follow me down the hall. For years, I managed to push the experience to the back of my mind, chalking it up to something I'd rather not understand. But the truth has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. About 2 years after my stay at the hotel, I was visiting a friend in another part of the country. We were catching up over drinks when he mentioned he'd been working on a podcast series about urban legends and local hauntings. Curious, I asked if he'd ever come across anything about the hotel. He hadn't, but he was immediately intrigued. When I told him the bare bones version of my experience, he insisted on recording it for his show. I reluctantly agreed, on the condition that he kept my name anonymous. I didn't want to be the person known for some ghost story, but part of me also wanted to know if anyone else had experienced something similar. The episode aired a few months later. To my surprise, it got a lot of attention. Listeners started writing in, sharing their own experiences at the hotel. Most of them were vague. Feelings of unease, hearing footsteps in empty hallways, or seeing shadows move in the corner of their vision. But a few were more specific. One person described staying in a room that sounded a lot like mine. They'd woken up in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping on the wall. Thinking it was a neighboring guest, they knocked back. The tapping stopped immediately, and a few moments later, they heard 3 loud bangs on their door. When they opened it, no one was there, but the door to the room next door, the same one I'd seen open, was ajar. Another listener claimed they worked at the hotel as a housekeeper years ago. She refused to clean the rooms on my floor unless someone else was with her. She said she often found strange things left behind in the empty rooms, scratched up furniture, broken picture frames, and once, an old reel of tape from a sound recorder. When she played it out of curiosity, all she heard was static and fade tapping. My friend was thrilled with the response to the episode, but I couldn't share his excitement. Every story just brought back memories I tried to bury. I stopped listening to his podcast after that, not because it wasn't good, but because it felt like tempting fate. Then, one night, I got an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was from someone claiming to be a former maintenance worker at the hotel. He said he'd listened to the podcast and recognized my story. According to him, the room next to mine wasn't just another guest room. It used to be a storage space for the theater across the street, back when the hotel and theater were under the same ownership. That's when he dropped the real bombshell. He claimed there were reports, hidden in old maintenance logs, of strange noises coming from that room long before it was converted into a guest room. Workers heard tapping, muffled voices, and sometimes music, even when the room was completely empty. One worker even swore he heard someone calling his name. But the strangest part, the room had been sealed off for decades. The door I'd seen open wasn't supposed to exist. I stared at the email, my stomach twisting. I wanted to dismiss it as a prank, but something about the way it was written, so matter of fact, with details I hadn't shared publicly, made it feel authentic. I replied, asking for proof. The man sent a scanned copy of an old blueprint of the hotel. Sure enough, the space where the room should have been was marked as sealed storage. I blocked his email after that. I didn't want to know anything else. If the room wasn't supposed to exist, then what had I seen? What had I heard? Even now, I think about it sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet, I'll hear faint tapping, a tree branch on the window, maybe, or the pipe settling. At least, that's what I tell myself. And every time, I have to resist the urge to knock back. This happened about 6 years ago when I was 22 and working as an admin assistant at a small law firm in a mid-sized city. It was a quiet job, mostly scheduling meetings, organizing files, and answering phones. Nothing exciting ever really happened, and I liked it that way. One Thursday afternoon, I was alone in the office. My boss was in court, and my coworkers had all left early for a team building retreat I couldn't attend because of a stomach bug earlier that week. The office was silent except for the hum of my desktop computer and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. Around 4 p.m., the phone rang. "Good afternoon, Jensen and Parker Law," I said automatically. There was a pause on the other end. Then a man's voice, smooth, deliberate, spoke. "Is this Erica?" I froze. My name wasn't on the website or the voicemail greeting. In fact, there was no public-facing information about me at all. "Oh, yes. Who's calling?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't worry about that," he replied. "I just wanted to thank you for the coffee this morning. You looked so nice in your green sweater." My blood went cold. I had stopped for coffee that morning, but I hadn't spoken to anyone in the shop. My sweater was green. "I think you have the wrong person," I stammered. "No, Erica," he said, almost laughing. "I don't." I hung up, my hands trembling. I immediately checked the office door. It was locked, and peeked out the windows. The street below was bustling with commuters and shoppers. No one stood out. I spent the next hour trying to focus on work, but every sound, every distant footstep, every phone notification made me jump. At 5 p.m., I grabbed my bag and left in a hurry. The next day, my boss called me into his office. He handed me a small, unmarked envelope that had been left at the front desk that morning. Inside was a single photograph, me sitting at my desk, taken through the office window. My green sweater was unmistakable. My boss called the police immediately. They took the photo as evidence but didn't seem particularly optimistic. "It's probably just some creep playing a prank," one of the officers said. I didn't feel comforted. That weekend, I stayed at my friend Melissa's apartment, too scared to be alone in my tiny studio. On Sunday night, as we were watching TV, me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. List you at the office Friday, Erica. I'll see you tomorrow. I didn't go to work the next day or any day after that. I quit my job, moved to a new city, and changed my phone number. The police never found out who sent the photo or the text, and no one ever came forward about the envelope. To this day, I have no idea how he knew my name, where I worked, or why he chose me. For a long time, I thought the nightmare was over. Moving to a new city brought some comfort, and I started fresh in a new job. I kept to myself, didn't post anything personal online, and stayed hyper aware of my surroundings. But then, about a year later, something happened that shook me to my core. I was living in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a secure building. It wasn't fancy, but it had a locked front entrance, and you needed a key fob to get past the lobby. It felt safe, until one evening when I came home from work. There, on the mat outside my door, was another envelope. No postage, no name. Just like the first one, my heart sank. With shaky hands, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words typed in bold. Dismay. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced. How had he found me? I had changed everything. My address, my phone number, even my name on social media. I called the building manager immediately, but the security cameras in the hallways had been malfunctioning for weeks. No footage, no leads. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every muffled voice in the hallway made my heart race. The next morning, I packed a bag and went to stay with a coworker. I didn't want to be alone, not until I figured out what to do. That was the start of another spiral. I started getting texts again, this time from a new number. They were simple, almost casual, but they made my blood run cold. Nice place. Red looks good on you. Don't move again. It's exhausting to keep finding you. Each message chipped away at my sanity. I felt watched everywhere I went. I stopped walking to work, stopped going to the grocery store, even stopped sitting near windows. I reported everything to the police, but without clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. One night, about 2 months after the envelope appeared, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was 3:17 a.m., another unknown number. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message was a single photo. It was me, asleep in my bed. My stomach dropped. I turned on every light in my apartment and grabbed a kitchen knife before calling 911. The police arrived within minutes, but they didn't find anyone. My door had been locked, and all the windows were secure. It didn't make sense. They searched the building and found no signs of forced entry, no strangers wandering the halls. One of the officers suggested it could be a prank, maybe even a tech-savvy stalker hacking into a smart device. I didn't have any smart devices. I left that apartment the next morning and never went back. Since then, I've moved twice more, changed my number again, and live in a state of constant paranoia. The messages have stopped, for now, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to remind me he hasn't forgotten. For a while, I thought I'd finally escaped him. Months turned into years, and the silence became almost comforting. I'd moved to a new state, changed jobs, and even legally altered my last name. I didn't tell anyone outside my closest circle where I lived. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd outrun him. But then, last month, I got a package. It wasn't delivered to my apartment. It came to my workplace. The receptionist handed it to me with a casual smile, completely unaware of the wave of dread that hit me. My name was handwritten on the box in neat, block letters. No return address. I hesitated before opening it. My coworkers were around, and I didn't want to cause a scene, so I brought it home, set it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it for what felt like hours before finally slicing the tape. Inside was a single item, a snow globe. It seemed innocent enough, a small glass dome with a scene of a little white house surrounded by trees. But as I shook it, something inside caught my eye. Under the artificial snow, there was a tiny, blurry photograph tucked against the base. My hands trembled as I tilted the globe to get a better look. It was a photo of me, at my new apartment. I couldn't breathe. The photo wasn't recent, thank God, but it was unmistakably from my current building. It had been taken during my first week there. The exact outfit and time of day burned into my memory. He'd found me again. I called the police, shaking so hard I could barely dial. When the officer arrived, I handed over the globe and explained everything. He was kind but skeptical, pointing out that there was no direct threat in the package. It could just be a strange coincidence, he said, his tone almost patronizing. But I knew better. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. For the next week, I didn't sleep. Every sound outside my window, every flicker of light in the hallway made my heart pound. I started double-checking every lock, every blind, every shadow. I'd even took time off work, too scared to leave my apartment. And then, last night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not in the hallway, not outside my window, inside my apartment. My heart raced as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from the living room toward the hallway. My apartment wasn't large. Whoever was out there would reach my bedroom in seconds. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers and whispered into the phone, "There's someone in my apartment." The operator told me to stay quiet and stay on the line, but I could barely focus. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. The silence was suffocating, and then, with agonizing slowness, the door handle turned. I screamed, raising the bat, just as the sound of sirens filled the street outside. The intruder must have heard them too because the handle stopped turning, and I heard frantic footsteps retreating toward the living room. By the time the police arrived, the door was wide open, but he was gone. The officers found no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been disturbed, except for one thing. Sitting on my kitchen counter was another snow globe. This one held a tiny replica of my apartment building, and inside it, just like before, was a small, blurry photograph of me. A few years ago, I worked the night shift as a float nurse at a large urban hospital. Being a float nurse meant I didn't have a permanent unit. I got assigned wherever they needed extra hands. I loved it because no two nights were ever the same. That is, until one night made me regret ever taking the job. It started like any other shift. I was assigned to the 4th floor, a mix of post-opus patients and some recovery from more serious illnesses. It wasn't my usual stomping ground, but I was familiar with the layout. The staff warned me that we had one patient, an elderly man named Mr. Hughes, who was known for wandering the halls at night. Just keep an eye out, they said. He's harmless but likes to explore. The night started uneventfully. Around 2 a.m., I went to check on Mr. Hughes. His room was at the end of the hall, tucked into a quieter corner. As I approached, I noticed his bed was empty. Not surprising, I figured he was wandering again. I glanced up and down the hallway but didn't see him. I headed toward the nurse's station to ask if anyone had seen him. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like slippers dragging against the linoleum, coming from the direction of the elevators. Relieved, I followed the sound, assuming I'd find Mr. Hughes. But when I turned the corner, the hallway was empty. The shuffling stopped. Feeling uneasy, I checked the elevators, the stairwell, even the break room, but there was no sign of him. I returned to his room to check if he'd somehow made it back without me noticing. When I opened the door, my stomach dropped. Mr. Hughes was in his bed, fast asleep. I shook it off as my imagination and continued my rounds. About an hour later, I was charting at the nurse's station when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was too dark to make out details, but it looked like someone in a hospital gown. Thinking it might be another patient, I called out, "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond. I stood and started walking toward them. "Are you okay?" I asked again. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't standing still. It was swaying slightly, side to side. I reached for the light switch on the wall, but the second the lights came on, the hallway was empty. I checked every room in that hallway, every closet, every corner. No one was there. By this point, my nerves were shot. I returned to the nurse's station and stayed glued to my chair. Around 4 a.m., a patient's call light went off. Room 423, one of the surgical recovery rooms. I grabbed my chart and headed down the hall. But when I got to the room, the patient was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and trembling. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned. She nodded but said, "There was someone in here." I froze. "What do you mean?" She described a man in a hospital gown standing at the foot of her bed. He just stood there, watching me. He didn't say anything. I thought maybe he was confused or lost, but when I blinked, he was gone. I tried to reassure her, but I felt anything but calm. I did another sweep of the floor, checking on every patient, but everything seemed normal. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. At the end of my shift, I told the charge nurse what had happened. She gave me a strange look and said, "You were on the 4th floor, right? That used to be the psych unit before they remodeled. We had a patient who passed away years ago, a man who used to wander the halls at night. Staff have reported seeing him ever since. Needless to say, I never floated to the 4th floor again. After that night, I did everything in my power to avoid being assigned to the 4th floor. I traded shifts, volunteered for double duty in the and even begged my supervisor to keep me on other units. She thought I was being dramatic, but thankfully she obliged. For months, I managed to steer clear of that place. Life went on, and I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined most of it. I chalked it up to stress, lack of sleep, and the natural spookiness of working nights in a hospital. But then, about 6 months later, the 4th floor found me again. We were short-staffed that night, and I was the only float nurse available. My heart sank when I saw my assignment at 4th floor. I tried to argue, but it was no use. The charge nurse assured me it was just another shift. "You'll be fine," she said. "That floor's been quiet lately." Quiet, right. I stepped off the elevator and was hit with the same uneasy feeling I'd had before. The hallway seemed darker, the air heavier. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and told myself to get through the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I focused on my tasks, avoiding the end of the hallway as much as possible. Around 3 a.m., the building felt eerily still. I was finishing up some paperwork at the nurse's station when the call light for room 423 went off again. My stomach churned. That was the same room as before. I grabbed my chart and walked to the room, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. When I opened the door, the patient, a middle-aged man recovering from surgery, was sitting up in bed, his face pale. "Are you okay?" I asked, already knowing what he would say. "There was someone in here," he whispered. "I thought it was you at first, but they were just standing there." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you see where they went?" He shook his head. "No, they just disappeared." I reassured him as best I could, but my hands were shaking as I adjusted his blankets and left the room. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a sudden chill. The air was ice cold, far colder than the rest of the building. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, the figure. This time, I could see him clearly. A gaunt man in a faded hospital gown, his features hollow and his eyes dark. He stood at the far end of the hallway, completely still. My heart pounded as I blinked, expecting him to vanish like before, but he didn't. He started walking toward me. I froze, my mind racing. He wasn't shuffling like Mr. Hughes had. His steps were deliberate, purposeful. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was halfway down the hall when the lights above him flickered and went out. When they came back on, he was gone. I didn't finish my shift that night. I called the charge nurse, handed over my pager, and left. I didn't even bother explaining. I just said I was feeling sick. I never worked another night shift again. I switched to day shifts in a different unit and eventually left the hospital altogether. I still don't know what I saw on that floor. Maybe it was a lingering spirit tied to the place where it spent its final days. Maybe it was something darker, but whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. You think that leaving the hospital would have been the end of it, but sometimes places, or whatever resides in them, don't let go so easily. About a year after I left the hospital, I started having strange dreams. At first, they were vague, just a sense of being watched in a dimly lit hallway, but over time, they became more vivid. In the dreams, I was back on the 4th floor, walking down that same corridor. It always ended the same way. I'd see the man in the hospital gown standing at the end of the hall, his dark eyes locked onto mine. No matter how much I tried to turn or wake myself up, I couldn't. He'd start walking toward me, each step echoing louder and louder until I woke up gasping for air. I told myself they were just nightmares, a lingering reaction to a traumatic experience. But then things started happening while I was awake. One night, I was working late in my new job at a clinic. The building was empty except for me and the janitor. I was filing some paperwork when I felt it, that same icy chill I'd felt on the 4th floor. My breath caught, and I turned around, expecting to see him standing there. The hallway was empty. Shaking it off, I went back to work. But as I was locking up for the night, I heard faint shuffling footsteps coming from the back office. My heart sank. I knew I was the only one there. For a split second, I thought about going to check, but fear took over and I bolted out of the building. It didn't stop there. Lights in my apartment began flickering for no reason. Doors I knew I closed would be slightly ajar when I came back. Once, I woke up to find my bedroom window open, though I always locked it before bed. My cat, usually calm and affectionate, started hissing at empty corners of the room. The worst came about a month later. I was staying at my parents' house for the weekend, trying to escape the unease that had been following me. Late one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my childhood bedroom. I thought it was my dad, but when I called out, the steps stopped abruptly. The door to my room creaked open just an inch. "Dad," I whispered. No response. The door stayed still for a moment, then slowly began to close. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my mom everything. She didn't say much, but later I overheard her talking to my dad. "Do you think she brought something back with her?" she whispered. I didn't ask what she meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Eventually, I moved to a new city, desperate for a fresh start. For a while, things seemed better. The dream stopped, the strange occurrences faded, and I started to feel like myself again. But last week, as I was leaving work, I passed by a reflective glass door. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A faint, shadowy figure standing just behind me. A man in a hospital gown. When I whipped around, there was no one there. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape him. Maybe some doors, once opened, can never be closed. My company had sent me to a trade show in a city halfway across the country. The trip was fine, nothing unusual, but my flight home was delayed late into the evening. By the time we were finally boarding, the terminal was nearly empty and a weird, eerie quiet hung in the air. I was seated near the back of the plane, a few rows away from a flight attendant station. The cabin was maybe a third full, and most people were spread out, claiming whole rows to themselves. I thought I was alone in my row until a man in a tattered jacket plopped down 2 seats away from me, reeking of stale alcohol and something metallic. back. He didn't have any luggage, not even a carry-on. He had this old, battered notebook clutched in his hands. His knuckles were raw, and there was a faint but noticeable bloodstain on his shirt collar. He stared straight ahead, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't make out. I immediately felt uneasy, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just having a bad day, and I'd be back home soon. Still, I texted a friend about the guy, jokingly saying, if I don't make it, blame C-28B. The plane took off, and everything seemed fine for the first hour. Most of the lights were dimmed, and the flight attendants were going through the motions of serving drinks. That's when I noticed the man had started writing furiously in his notebook. Every so often, he'd glance sideways at me, his pen freezing mid-word. The flight was quiet enough that I could hear him whispering under his breath again. I leaned just slightly to try to catch what he was saying. It wasn't in English, maybe Latin or something that sounded ancient. His voice got louder, but not enough to attract attention from the flight attendants or other passengers. And then he stopped. He turned and looked directly at me for the first time. His eyes were a pale, watery blue that almost seemed to glow in the dim light. Earmarked, he said, his voice low but steady. I'd move if I were you. I froze. He turned back to his notebook and resumed writing, ignoring me completely. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I stayed in my seat, silently begging the plane to land. It wasn't long before things got even stranger. A flight attendant came to check on us, and when she reached our row, her polite smile faltered. She glanced at the man, her brow furrowing as if she was trying to place him. Then she said, almost hesitantly, sir, are you feeling okay? The man didn't look up, just kept scribbling in his notebook, but he muttered something that made the flight attendant's face go pale. She backed away, mumbling, I'll get you some water, before disappearing down the aisle. The plane started to feel colder. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it didn't help. I noticed a few other passengers shivering or rubbing their arms. The lights above us flickered, and the man chuckled quietly, still writing. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, pretending I needed to use the restroom, and moved to an empty row near the middle of the plane. As soon as I sat down, I felt warmer, safer. The man didn't look at me again for the rest of the flight, but I could feel his presence like a weight on my chest. When we landed, I practically sprinted off the plane. I waited in the terminal, watching to see if the man got off, but he never did. I even asked one of the flight attendants if she'd seen him, and she gave me a confused look. There was no one at 28B, she said. He was sitting alone. After that flight, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something had followed me. I'd always been skeptical of the paranormal, but the experience left me questioning everything. At first, I tried to chalk it up to exhaustion, stress, or even some kind of waking dream, but the strange occurrences didn't stop once I was back home. The first incident happened the night I got back. My apartment felt off as soon as I walked in, like it wasn't entirely empty, even though I lived alone. My cat, normally the first to greet me, was nowhere to be found. I finally found her hiding under the bed, growling softly, her eyes wide and fixed on the empty doorway. I figured she was just spooked by me being away, so I tried to comfort her, but she wouldn't come out. That night, I had a vivid nightmare. I was back on the plane, sitting in 28B. The man was there, scribbling furiously in his notebook. Except this time, he wasn't muttering, he was laughing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. When he looked at me, his eyes were completely black, and his voice echoed in my head, you didn't listen. Earmarked. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The air in my room felt heavy, and I could swear I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the walls. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day at work, things got even weirder. My computer screen flickered, and my files kept randomly closing. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but then I noticed a single file on my desktop that I didn't recognize. Its name was just a string of random numbers. Furious but hesitant, I opened it. The file was blank except for one line of text, you can't outrun what's already inside you. I slammed the laptop shut and called it, but they couldn't find any trace of the file. They brushed it off as a phishing attempt, but I knew better. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid and horrifying than before. The man wasn't just laughing anymore, he was closer, leaning in until I could feel his breath on my skin. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. Objects in my apartment weren't where I left them. My cat, usually calm and affectionate, became skittish and hissed at empty corners. In the cold, it was always cold, no matter how high I turned up the heat. Desperate, I reached out to a friend who was into the occult. I hadn't told anyone the full story yet, but she didn't seem surprised. After listening to me, she suggested I try a cleansing ritual to sever any ties to the energy from the flight. I followed her instructions to the letter, burning sage and reciting prayers she'd given given me. For a moment, the air felt lighter, and I thought it had worked until the sage stick extinguished itself mid-burn. The coal returned instantly, and I heard that same guttural laugh, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I spun around, but of course, no one was there, just the faint scent of stale alcohol and metal lingering in the air. I didn't think it could get worse, but I was wrong. After the failed cleansing ritual, the activity around me grew more aggressive. Lights in my apartment would flicker and then explode, leaving shards of glass scattered across the floor. My phone would ring at odd hours, and when I answered, there'd be nothing but static and sometimes faint whispering I couldn't quite make out. The breaking point came one night when I was sitting on my couch trying to distract myself with a movie. The shadows in the room felt heavier than usual, pressing in on me. My cat was perched on the back of the couch, her eyes fixed on the hallway. She growled low in her throat, the fur along her spine standing on end. Then I saw it. A figure moved in the hallway, just a fleeting shadow, too quick to be natural. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a decorative glass vase, and stood up, heart pounding. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I crept toward the hallway, clutching the vase so tightly my knuckles turned white. The air grew colder with each step, and my breath came out in visible puffs. My cat hissed and bolted under the couch. When I reached the end of the hallway, I flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. The bulb didn't even flicker, it was just dead. The silence was deafening. Then, from the bathroom at the end of the hall, I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails on tile. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move. I pushed the bathroom door open with the vase, not daring to step inside. The room was empty, but the mirror over the sink had fogged up, as though someone had just taken a hot shower. In the fog, a single word was scrawled, soon. I dropped the vase and stumbled backward, my hands shaking. The vase shattered on the floor, and the sound seemed to snap me out of my paralysis. I grabbed my cat, threw on my coat, and ran out of the apartment without looking back. I spent the night at a friend's house. She didn't ask many questions, just let me crash on her couch and listened as I spilled everything. To her credit, she didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. Instead, she offered to help me find someone who could deal with whatever this was. The next day, she introduced me to a woman named Nadia, a self-proclaimed medium and paranormal investigator. Nadia didn't ask a lot of questions. She simply listened as I recounted the events, nodding thoughtfully. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't just a spirit. This is something older, something darker. It latched onto you during that flight, and it's feeding off your fear." Her words sent a chill down my spine. She explained that the entity likely wasn't tied to a specific place. It had chosen me. It marked you, she said, as prey. Nadia suggested a more intense cleansing ritual, one that would require confronting the entity directly. I hesitated, but what choice did I have? I couldn't live like this anymore. That weekend, we performed the ritual in my apartment. Nadia set up candles, herbs, and crystals in a circle in the middle of my living room. She instructed me to sit in the center while she chanted in a language I didn't recognize. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the apartment itself was resisting her efforts. Then it appeared, the man from the play. He stood just outside the circle, his face partially obscured by shadows. His notebook was gone, but his hands were clenched into fists, and his pale, glowing eyes bored into mine. His mouth twisted into a mocking grin as he spoke, his voice dripping with malice. "You can't send me away," he said. "I'm part of you now." Nadia didn't stop chanting, her voice growing louder and more insistent. The candles flickered wildly, and the circle of light around me seemed to grow brighter, pushing the figure back. He snarled, his grin fading, and for a moment, I thought the ritual was working. But then, he laughed, that same guttural, bone-chilly laugh from the plane. The candles went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, he was gone. Nadia looked shaken but determined. "It's weakened," she said, "but it's not gone. You need to leave this place and never look back." I didn't need to be told twice. Within a week, I broke my lease, packed what I could, and moved to a new city far from everything familiar. It's been months now, and for the most part, things have been quiet. No more shadows, no strange noises, no cryptic messages. But sometimes, late at night, I feel that cold, suffocating air again, and I can almost hear it, that faint, guttural laugh echoing just beyond the edge of my awareness. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.